So we're starting chapter 11. So now in chapter 11, we're going to be first talking about movement, and then we're going to be then talking about somatosensory pathways. And so this overall sensory pattern is the same across these multiple senses. The sensory information comes in through the receptors, into the thalamic relay nuclei, into the primary sensory cortex, the secondary sensory cortex, and then finally into the association cortices. Movement uses a similar pattern, but the direction is basically changed. So the directions need to start up here in the association cortex, and then they're sent down to the secondary motor cortex and the primary motor cortex, then to the brainstem motor nuclei, so they don't go through the thalamus, but they go through the brainstem, and then they go to the muscles. So they follow a very, very similar pattern, but it's pretty much reversed. Now, we went over this before, but it's going to become even more important. Afferent sensory information travels from the body inward via the somatic nervous system, and movement information travels out of the central nervous system via a parallel efferent motor system. So the best way to help remember this is efferent would be for exit. So E for efferent, E for exit. So efferent information is exiting or leaving the body. Whereas afferent is the opposite. Afferent is incoming information. So there's a couple of major components of the motor system that are really important for movement control. So one, we have the cerebrum. This is the forebrain, and this is conscious control of movement. So this is in some of your association cortices. This is going to be cortex. This could be in the frontal lobes, aspects of the parietal lobes. So basically your higher order cortex. Then the next component is the brainstem. So this is important for automatic movements. And then to the spinal cord. So the key elements of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, the brainstem linking the two, these are the major components of the motor system. With impaired brainstem or spinal cord function, the forebrain can imagine movements but can no longer produce them. So that's what happens when you are paralyzed. You can't make movements because the information cannot be sent from your brain, your cerebrum or your forebrain, down to your muscles. Other important regions of the motor system are the subcortical basal ganglia. We'll be talking about this later in this chapter. The basal ganglia helps to produce the appropriate amount of force for grasping, and the cerebellum. The cerebellum helps to regulate the timing and accuracy of movement. And so we'll be returning to each of these throughout this chapter. So to return to this relationship for outgoing and incoming information, if we're going to engage in a movement, first thing that we do is we have visual information that comes in, and this is going to help us locate where the object is, how we want to interact with the world. So if we want to, as in the example here, pick up a cup, then we have to have visual information to locate the target. Then we have to have frontal lobe motor areas plan the reach and the command functions for the movement. And then the spinal cord carries the information to the hand. The motor neurons carry messages to the muscles of the hand and the forearm. And then the sensory receptors on the fingers send messages to the sensory cortex saying that the cup has been grasped. So the information exits the brain, travels down the spinal cord, through the muscles, into your sensory receptors. They register that you have the cup in hand. Then this sensory information travels back up the spinal cord. Then it enters the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia judges the force that would be needed, and then the cerebellum corrects the movement errors. So how you need to hold the cup, how much force you need to hold the cup, and then the information continues up to the sensory cortex. This receives this message that the cup has been grasped, and then there will be connections between the sensory cortex and the motor cortex that will then also signal, okay, the cup has been grasped, and so then the next series of movements can be planned. which would basically be after you grasp the cup, then the next series of movements would be to lift it. And that would again involve that would again involve instructions from the frontal lobe to plan the movement. The spinal cord is going to carry this information down, and so on and so forth. So movement involves a cycle of outgoing instructions and incoming information that indicates whether those instructions have been carried out or not. And this cycle goes through continuously so that your body can effectively interact and move within the environment. So a big researcher in this area, Lashley, he was one of the original researchers that proposed this sort of feedback loop. He said he proposed that after we act, we wait for feedback about how well the action has succeeded, and then we make the next movement accordingly. So movements must be performed as motor sequences, with one sequence held in readiness while an ongoing sequence is being completed. As one sequence is being executed, the next sequence is being prepared so that it can follow the first smoothly. And so this is a nice continuation of that idea that I just talked about, how the instructions are going to be sent down, the sensory information is going to confirm that the instructions have been carried out. While that is occurring, the next step is sort of in movement is being prepared, and so on and so forth. So when we plan a movement, how does this motor sequence actually occur? So movement modules are pre-programmed by the brain and produced as a unit. And so the frontal lobes are really important for planning complex behavior, and they plan all forms of complex behavior. They are involved in planning goal-directed behaviors, complex movements. So the prefrontal cortex plans behavior, and then it sends these overall plans to the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex then produces the appropriate complex movement sequences, and then the primary motor cortex specifies how each movement is to be carried out. So if you wanted to take this in sort of rough terms, think of an example where you have an idea that you want to build a house. So then you're going to have you're going to have some ideas of what you want in that house, and then you might talk with a designer or some contractors and communicate those ideas. Or you'll communicate those ideas to an architect. An architect will then draw up the plans. And so this plan will basically be like the organized movement sequences. And then who will produce those specific elements of your house will be the contractor. And so just as the motor cortex produces specific movements, the contractor would then produce or create the specific parts of the house. So when you plan movements, it functions in very much that same way. Another thing that's really important to realize about movement is that we all have species-typical movement. So species-typical behavior are actions produced by every member of a species. So cats hiss, dogs bark. So every species has some sort of species-specific behavior. Species-specific behavior also tends to be automatic, and the brainstem is particularly important in automatic behaviors. So other types of automatic behaviors and adaptive movements include maintaining posture, standing upright, coordinating movements of the limbs, swimming and walking, grooming the fur, and making nests. So we all have behavior that is species specific. We always stand upright and walk, but this of course is something that is specific to our species. Species specific behaviors are automatic and they are maintained by your brainstem. And so this is really adaptive because then your higher order cognitive regions of the brain, your prefrontal cortex, your parietal lobes, your temporal lobes, they can be involved in more complex cognition, so they don't have to spend the cognitive resources to manage all of these automatic behaviors. As I mentioned earlier, the spinal cord is particularly important for the execution of movement because it basically links the brain and the body. So if you have damage to the spinal cord, then you're not going to be able to send the messages to the limbs, to the various parts of your body to engage in movement, nor is your body able to send the information that it receives up to the brain. So quadriplegia is paralysis and loss of sensation in the legs and arms due to spinal cord injury, and paraplegia is paralysis and loss of sensation confined to the legs and lower body due to spinal cord injury. So those are two types of spinal cord injuries. In humans and other animals with a severed spinal cord, spinal reflexes still function even though the spinal cord is cut off from communication with the brain. So paralyzed limbs may display spontaneous movements or spasms. The brain can no longer guide the timing of these automatic movements, but it does occasionally engage in spontaneous movements. This is also adaptive at a muscular level because it is advantageous for your muscles to stay active in some sense. So even if you have spontaneous movement, that's going to represent itself as some activity, and that activity is going to help the neurons stay a little bit more active and ready for when they receive information from the brain.